This is Dylan FM, the podcast that goes deep into the work and world of Bob Dylan. If you love Dylan, you're in the right place. With your host, Craig Danieloff.
What do Frank Zappa, Elvis Costello, Laurie Anderson, Martin Mull, and Thelonious Monk have in common? The following quote has been attributed to each of them. Writing about music is like dancing to architecture. If you want to know who really said it, check the show notes. But this confusion about the quote may have distracted from a bigger problem, which is that it's just plain wrong. When writing about music is done well, it's fantastic and effective. We've had at least 5 authors talk about their books on Dylan FM so far, each sharing elements of their books with us, all because they fit the context of our focus, mostly last year's Season 1 look at Time Out of Mind. But I don't want to limit us anymore to just talking to authors whose works align with our seasonal focus. So in this episode, we're going to start a new occasional series in which we'll talk to authors about cool Dylan books just because they're cool Dylan books. Today we're going to talk about a brand new book called Bob Dylan in Minnesota. It's the third in a series. The first was Bob Dylan in London, and then came Bob Dylan in the Big Apple. And our guest today is the co-author of each of these books and the guiding hand behind the series. Keith Miles is a longtime Dylan fan. He attended the Isle of Wight Festival in 1969 as a very small child, I'm sure. And today he's the co-curator of the Dylan Room in London's Troubadour Club. His co-authors on this Minnesota book include a bunch of great Dylan writers and fans, such as Paul Metsa, Ed Newman, Marc Percansky, and Matt Steichein. Plus, there are contributions from Linda Whiteside and Kevin Odegard. A lot of Dylan books, like a lot of Dylan songs, are serious, lengthy, and a bit intense. They demand attention, concentration, and some focus to really get the most out of them. But as we all know, there are Dylan songs that are just simple, good fun, the kind you can take in and enjoy without breaking a sweat. And that's more the style of the Dylan In series. They're not the slimmest Dylan books. The new one is 42 chapters, but they're light and easy reading, and the chapters are sometimes just a few pages long. You can get through them in 1 or 2 sittings easily if you want to. But it's their focus that makes them unique. Each of the locations that they've chosen so far have been a big part of Dylan's life over the past 60 or even 80 years. And by focusing on the events and people that took place in these locations, it turns out to be a really nice way to tell the story. These would be great books for any young or new Dylan fans, but as someone who has plowed through many of the fatter volumes, I still learned a few things and really enjoyed reading each of them. Keith joins me today and we talk about this new Minnesota book, which you can get via Amazon or at other bookstores now. I'll include links to all of them in the show notes, as well as Keith's other volume on Bob Dylan and Dylan Thomas. Check the show notes. We talk a little bit about the series in this interview and discuss some of the chapters and events that you'll read about in Bob Dylan in Minnesota. In the longer premium version of this podcast, we talk more about Dylan himself, more about the other books, and a little more about the contents of this one. To get the extended version of this podcast and all of our other shows, as well as bonus episodes and cool exclusives from our FM podcast network partners like Pod Dylan, sign up for FM Plus or FM Premium. You can subscribe right in the Apple Podcast app, or if you don't use that, visit us at fmpods.com. It's just $4.99 a month, and you'll unlock over 100 premium episodes, and more importantly, support our work and that of our podcasting partners. That will help us to keep bringing you these great deep Dylan dives. But for now, here's our chat with Keith Miles about Bob Dylan in Minnesota. All right, Keith Miles, welcome. Thanks for joining us to talk about your new book, Bob Dylan in Minnesota.
Thank you. Thank you, Craig. Thank you for having me on the show.
Well, third in a series, so you're rapidly rising up the list of prolific Bob Dylan authors. You did a really nice book of Bob Dylan in London, which I really enjoyed, and then a few years ago now, I think. We can talk about these a little bit. You did New York, and this is the third stop. We're in Minnesota. I guess a little backdrop on your Dylan fandom and how you came to become a Dylan author, taking us on this world tour.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's actually more than that and quicker than that. In fact, because I got to the age of 61 without writing any books whatsoever, and 2 years later, I've written 4 books and had them published. So it's been an incredibly rapid 2 years. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've been knocking them out, as they say, and it was one of those strange things. We went into the sort of pandemic over here, and I had put together a lot of stuff with a friend of mine, Jackie Lee's on Bob Dylan in London, and through the joys of Twitter, of all things, we got approached by publishers who said, "This looks really interesting stuff. Would you like to do it in a proper book?" And it was fabulous. It was great, and Jackie and I did the Bob Dylan in London book, and it really was. There were certain things we wanted to do. Number one, we were Londoners and Bob Dylan fans, so we wanted to put the record straight on the trips and the pubs he'd been to, and interview the right people and do the research properly, which hadn't been done. The hundreds and hundreds of Bob Dylan books, had a lot of the pubs wrong, and in the 62 visit and things like that we just felt passionately we wanted to put right, and also for people to visit the places. It's a joy that as a main centre of popular music, London has fantastic places for tourists, Dylan and otherwise, and they're kind of ignored. And we had taken over and started to run the Dylan Room at the Troubadour Club in London, and if we could stop tourists going to Oxford Street and go to places like that instead, then we're doing a good job. So it was always intended to be a guidebook, which is why it's a paperback. You can put it in your pocket. It is one you can read and enjoy the stories, but also you can use as a guide as well. And the other thing we wanted to do was, I sitting in a room next to a library of literally hundreds of Bob Dylan books. I can't stop collecting the darn things. And not a lot of them are a great deal of fun. And, I think Bob Dylan is a great deal of fun. And I think that, the people around him and the characters and the people are rich. Is a rich tapestry of musicians and fun people. And, someone like Bob Dylan, does live life to the full. And I think that Dylan books had become a little bit bogged down and were getting a bit too worthy and a bit too serious about everything. And I think, we wanted to inject some great tale, tell people some great stories about Bob Dylan and his, and his world, and that's what we did. And, wonderfully, the book was well received. And from having never considered doing this, we suddenly had an Amazon #1 bestseller in the category, and it was right, okay. And Jackie didn't want to write any more books. That was a process enough for her. But the publishers said, "Would you write 3 more?" And which is exactly what I've done, completing. We then, say, in the middle of the pandemic, they said, "Well, look, we'd like you to do one about New York, because that's the sensible next stop, really, and an important one to have a guide." And being in the pandemic, I couldn't go to New York. So I had to have good researchers out there, which was fabulous. And people like Anne Margaret Daniel and others who are, they're the people that know. I know London, I'm a Londoner, but, I don't know New York, and these people do. And really, the Big Apple book that came out is kind of down to those people, really, who really do know their stuff. But but there were certain things I wanted to do with the second book, with the Big Apple book. One of which was um, interview AJ Weberman, and that was interesting. I thought, how do you find this guy? And someone just gave me his number and said, just ring him up and you can chat to him. And he had to go in the book. He's the pantomime villain in lots of ways. And he's as crazy as a bag of spanners, but I did really enjoy the honesty of the guy, and I think he's like that ultimate fan that goes just that one step or two too far with everything, and he was honest about that, and I said to him, what kind of regrets do you have? And he did say, I shouldn't have knocked on the family's door and done all these things, and but it was great, and these were wonderful, wonderful, say interesting stories to put in there. And the new book is the third of the guide trilogy. So the Minnesota book is the third that's actually usable as a guide with maps. But the third book that I did was a slightly different approach, which was a book that I wanted to put together, which was the two Dylans, Bob Dylan and Dylan Thomas. It's not a guide as such, so it doesn't fit in with the Troubadour Tales trilogy in the same sort of way, but a little personal side project. I find them both of the same kind of rare ilk, which is, again, you look at the phrase troubadour, but they are very much, not my phrase. They're doing form literature. It's a different thing. What Bob Dylan does, he doesn't sing poetry. He's doing something else. I think it's encapsulated in that term, not my term, but form literature, I think, is what he and Dylan Thomas were doing. And so we come round to the Minnesota book and the last of the four books.
Let's look at a little bit. The book has a lot. What is it? 40 chapters, 42 chapters. You cover a lot of ground. You start with the early days, about the houses, about the family journey, the bar mitzvah story. That was interesting. The tracking down of the original traveling rabbi.
Yeah, that must have been a heck of a strange thing, with the almost mythical rabbi that came out of the snowy mists and then disappeared as swiftly as he'd arrived. It was I think even the what Bob Dylan said about this, he sees it as an odd, strange time, but he tried to, as everyone did, sort of change his persona as soon as he got to Greenwich Village. But he had a good full childhood, and his life growing up was pretty interesting and in relative terms pretty normal and sound. But there you go. The rabbi that came and went must have been a strange thing to a young lad at that time.
Yeah, I don't think that's that unusual in many parts of the United States, because there wasn't rabbis for people. In some places where the Jews weren't dense. I've heard of other places where they bring one in or something. But to be Bob Dylan's rabbi, as you say, from Brooklyn, and how he got there and how he was a mystery for so long, it's a great story, and it's really a good example of you giving the flavor of one out of many interesting things that happened there, and then moving on to something else.
Yeah, and also I think it's one of those things where I personally enjoyed the sort of fairly concentrated research on the background to two the two brothers, the rabbi and his brother, and where they came from and all that sort of side. And one of the things I found in the books uh, that we put together in the Troubadour Tales is some of these things that just, for example, in the London book, the first one, when Bob Dylan meets Robert Graves, in Chronicles, he talks about going around a London square and, in typical fashion, it's not the right name. And the research was just essentially going to where party was at Earl's Court, and looking, and no one had been to find where this square was or what it was called. Just actually bothering to go there was the research, and that's like, I like to think that in each of the Troubadour Tales book, at least every other page there's a crikey, I didn't know that story that crops up, even for Bob Dylan fans, and I am essentially still a very much just a fan, and will remain so. But it's interesting. We like to think that in all of the Troubadour Tales, there's enough for the novice and the vaguely interested in the music, but also enough in there for a decent level fan, you know.
Yeah, no. As a hardcore, I enjoyed him a lot. The Orpheum Theater story, for example, I knew he owned it. The time frames might have been vague to me. I didn't know that, David worked there and the kids spent time there. And it's that kind of insider flavor of reality, little
Yeah,
tidbits that I think are very
yeah.
nice. And the
And I
motorcycle
think,
accident, that I had heard of that, I think, but didn't know as much about it and forgot. So the second motorcycle accident in Minnesota, or the train incident, that was
oh, well,
also
well, it was one of those. It was one of the things. It's Matt, really. I mean, he knows his stuff, and he had. We were talking about things that should go in the book essentially, and it was a throwaway line. Well, and maybe something about the day Bob was nearly hit by a train. Well, what's that? Well, that's got to go in. Well, whatever that is, that's got to go in. And it was, yeah, fabulous learning from people who've known these stories for many years, and the four guys, like I say, I mean, to me, absolute Minnesota legends in their different fields, but also, know so much of this information that we've distilled down to get the tales across. But interesting you say about David, he kind of crops up in this story every so often, like with the Blood on the Tracks band and things like that, and you just think he's a little unsung hero in the Bob Dylan story, but certainly as part of the Minnesota link. Clearly he does crop up, throughout the years on all of this, and yeah, he's managed, um, either deliberately or accidentally, to steer Bob into some great things. A little bit more kudos to David for what he's done for the family, really.
yeah. I also enjoyed the bit about the time he spent on the farm, in the mid 70s, when the Blood on the Tracks writing time, where again there's a little more color in there than I've heard about, his mom coming by and the kids spending time and all of that, and a lot of the re-mentioning of the friends that he maintained over the years. Talk about the difficulty of being Bob Dylan. One of the ways he seems to have dealt with it is to keep a pretty nice cadre of friends that were from the before times, that he,
Yeah,
even in the midst of his crazy life and travels and being who he was, he maintained that set of friendships, and they all appear in the book as well.
yeah. I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and it is interesting that people seem to be. I mean, obviously, in this case, it's family as well, but people do seem to be very loyal to Bob Dylan. The guy is. I mean, he's no saint, and I'm sure he's a really difficult person to. I mean, interviewing Scarlett Rivera for the New York book. Um, you know, one of the things that came through is that her, bless her, wonderful human being and great artist, but essentially her career just went stratospheric, really, over a short period of time with Desire and the Rolling Thunder review, and then it gone again, and it's kind of and other people, like I I so wanted to put in a chapter in that book about the Letterman show and the Plugs. Again, these were all bunches of people who spent time having worked with Bob Dylan and hit the heights of their career, but then spent time waiting by the telephone for a call that never came. But still love the guy and still, you know, feel a great affection and loyalty towards him. And this is something he cultivated from sort of Dinky Town, Greenwich Village onwards. Everyone wants to kind of look after him and and retain a sort of loyalty and a fondness towards him, however awful he is at times, or however, in conventional terms, he lets people down or whatever. They're still there. I suppose
Yeah.
the biggest example is Joan Baez. I mean, you would support him to the ends of the earth. Despite him being pretty bad towards her at various stages, career and personal and otherwise. But like I say, he manages you know to have this great charm that promotes great loyalty in people, and that's plus he's Bob Dylan. Come on, he's like there's no artist like him. Of course, you're going to be loyal to him.
Yeah. Well, also, the other
And
thing I wanted to mention is the photos in the book. While there aren't many, they're very well chosen, and I thought they're the interesting kind of things that most people haven't seen. The Dinky Town photo of maybe the scholar that I thought was great. The Duluth house. Every time they came up, I was like, oh, that's a photo that I haven't seen 100 times. I think
yeah,
those
no,
are well chosen.
it was good. The process of getting the book out. I had the four Minnesota guys, and they've got access to just so much stuff, clearly, and it's a lot of it is pretty new or relatively unseen before, and that was great. I mean, narrowing it down was the difficult bit. Ed Newman's voracious. He would send you 20 different pictures a day, which is brilliant, but you got to narrow things down a little bit, because otherwise the book doesn't get in your back pocket to go around as a guide.
The idea of these books as a guide is really great. I wish, when I drove through Duluth and actually I didn't go to Duluth. When I drove through Hibbing, I was kind of looking around. I knew of Zimmy's and but to have all this would really make a great trip.
Yeah, well, it was important when we started the sort of series. I just kind of think that we don't really, and I say this from London, where we have one of the richest pop music histories, and we don't make the best of it. And there is no wonderfully great music tourism, and you can go to places. You could, you know, for example, if you go up to the Manchester Free Trade Hall, which is now a hotel, there's no great big Judas plaque. What's going on here? you know, but it's kind of everywhere. Do you know, the bizarre thing is the only place that really has embraced that, and probably taken it way too far, is Liverpool. A few years ago, you could go to Liverpool and you wouldn't know where to start with any Beatles stuff or where to look.
Mm.
Now, there's a Beatles museum on every corner, but it's
Yeah.
but at least it's there. At least they realise that, and I think it's the same with New York as well. It's where to start to look at
Yeah, I
wonderful
like it
places.
this way. I think it's more fun if the people who have your book or have something in their hand and know can find it. And in New
Oh
York, yeah,
yeah,
well, you can go to the different apartments, or you can go to the Chelsea Hotel, or you can go to the recording studios are around town, and lots of things. And it's kind of funner to arrive there and know you're at the right place, and that no one else around you kind of knows. You know what I mean?
oh yeah. No, I agree. I mean, the best way to do this would be for every town and city with music history to have a Troubadour Tales book.
Well, I'm glad you. I didn't realize it was 2 years, but I'm glad you set out and did this enterprise, because they really are, as we said, fun, unique, and interesting for new and old fans alike. set of books. So I think I know I sped read the London one when I first got it, and I sped read Minnesota today to get ready for this, and so that they can be done fast, but they're full of good stuff. So congratulations and thanks for time to do them.
Thank you so much, Craig. Thank you.
Did you enjoy this show? Then please rate this podcast and leave a review. It really helps. Also, sign up for 7 Days, our free weekly newsletter that puts all the top Bob Dylan news and links into your inbox every Sunday. Use the link in the show notes. Thanks for listening.